air traffic controller noticed something strange. Another jet was following the legendary presidential plane Air Force One. A second dot appeared on the radar, and a blurry silhouette, like a shadow, appeared in the sky. He decided to investigate this mystery and discovered something that changed his life forever. The reason why this plane exists will shock you. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new stories, and write in the comments which country you're watching from. The first night shift that placed Marcus alone in the upper watchroom felt like the culmination of every hour of study, every moment of discipline he had endured to prove he belonged among the guardians of the skies. For months he had trained, first under the constant supervision of his superiors, later in tandem with other junior controllers, always with an instructor's voice over his shoulder, reminding him of the smallest errors. But tonight he was trusted with his own console. There were others in the room, yes, older men and women seated at their glowing stations, their attention spread across the enormous electronic map of the air above the continent, but his console was his responsibility alone. He had been given a sector to monitor, a slice of the heavens that could stretch hundreds of miles, and the thought filled him with equal parts dread and pride. Marcus was young, not long out of training, but he carried himself with a quiet gravity that belied his age. His father had served in the military and often told him that discipline was the only shield a man could truly rely on in the world. His mother, a schoolteacher, had given him a different sort of shield, a love of knowledge, the habit of always asking why things were the way they were. Between the two influences, he had grown into a man who was calm on the surface, but beneath the calm burned a need to prove himself, to show that his race, his youth, his inexperience would not be marks against him in a field that demanded absolute perfection. The room hummed with low mechanical sound. Banks of monitors stretched like glowing walls, dotted with green and amber lights that represented machines the size of small towns moving through the air at impossible speeds. The faint static of radios filled the background, punctuated by clipped voices reciting call signs, coordinates, vectors. The voices never lingered, never spoke more than they needed to. To Marcus, the sound was almost comforting, like the rhythm of a song he was beginning to know by heart. He could feel the weight of the night outside, the immensity of the dark pressing against the tall windows of the tower, and he felt cocooned in light, in machines, in duty. That evening was not just any evening. Everyone in the tower knew that the president's plane was crossing their airspace. Air Force One, the legendary flying fortress that no one outside of the military truly understood, was scheduled to pass through within the hour. It was not unusual for the president to travel, but for Marcus this was the first time he would watch the plane appear on his screen, the first time his hands would steady the air lanes for the most important passenger in the world. The older controllers kept their faces neutral, their eyes cool, but Marcus could sense the unspoken tension in the room. No one treated such a flight casually. Protocols doubled, redundancies were checked 3 times over. Every blip on the radar was cross-referenced and confirmed. He followed the example of the veterans, masking his excitement under layers of routine, but inside his chest his heart kept drumming faster than it should. When the call came over the system that the presidential aircraft had entered the edge of their jurisdiction, the atmosphere in the room subtly shifted. Even without words, everyone straightened in their seats. Marcus leaned forward, adjusting his headset, his eyes locked on the sweep of the radar arm as it traced its circle across the screen. For a moment, there was nothing. Only the scatter of signals he already knew. Cargo planes, regional flights, the whisper of high-altitude military patrols. Then, just where he expected it, A new mark appeared. The dot was sharper, brighter than the rest, pulsing with the unique code of the aircraft it represented. His screen identified it at once, matching the signal to the encrypted signature of Air Force One. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He was seeing it, the aircraft that carried the president, that had become a myth and a symbol across the world, reduced to a glowing symbol on his screen. He whispered the confirmation code into his microphone, steady despite the thundering of his heart, and the voice of his supervisor acknowledged with a brief nod. Around the glowing dot moved several smaller ones, the fighter escorts. They flanked the plane like hounds running at the side of a lion, keeping perfect formation, each signal moving in harmony with the next. Marcus found himself staring longer than he should, marveling at the precision, the way machines worth hundreds of millions of dollars carved through the night sky with the grace of birds. He thought of the crew inside, the pilots with their nerves of steel, the soldiers who had trained for years to guard the sky around a single man. He thought, too, of the man inside, the president, perhaps reading a speech, perhaps asleep, perhaps staring out a window into the same darkness Marcus himself was watching. He adjusted his screens, cross-checking altitudes and speeds, making sure the path was clear ahead. Everything lined up perfectly. The presidential aircraft glided through his sector like a giant swan across a lake, serene and unstoppable. Marcus felt a strange swell of pride that his hands, his judgment, his eyes were a part of this moment, that he was another unseen cog in the vast machine that protected the head of state. Minutes passed. The escorts kept their tight formation. The glowing dot at the center moved steadily across the screen, and Marcus fell into the rhythm of monitoring. He noted changes in speed, confirmed altitudes, relayed updates. His fingers hovered over the controls with mechanical precision, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the significance of the moment. He imagined telling his mother that he had watched over the president's flight, that his responsibility had extended to the highest office in the land. She would smile, perhaps with that proud gleam in her eyes, and tell him again that discipline and knowledge would always carry him further than doubt. Yet, beneath the pride lay a tiny thread of unease, the awareness that such responsibility meant living in the shadow of catastrophe. Every controller knew it. One mistake, one unnoticed anomaly, could mean disaster. With ordinary flights, that was bad enough. With Air Force One, the stakes were beyond comprehension. He tried not to dwell on it, pushing the thought away, focusing instead on the crisp perfection of the data before him. Time stretched in that peculiar way it always did on night shifts. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes like hours. Yet, when he looked at the clock, he was startled to see how quickly the flight had advanced across his sector. Soon, the aircraft would pass out of his jurisdiction and into the next. He would hand over control, file his notes, and the moment would pass into memory. He would remember it as his first true test, and he would know he had passed. As the plane neared the edge of his screen, Marcus leaned back slightly, allowing himself a brief exhale of relief. Everything had gone exactly as it should. No turbulence, no unexpected traffic, no glitches. Just a flawless passage of the most important aircraft in the world. He thought he could almost relax, but then, just as he prepared to mark the handoff in his log, the sweep of the radar arm revealed something that should not have been there. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a flicker of light on the screen that could have been dismissed as interference. Marcus blinked, leaning forward, adjusting the contrast, convincing himself it was nothing. Yet, as the seconds passed, the mark grew clearer, steadier. Another dot, following the presidential plane at a precise distance, mimicking its every move. He froze. His training told him to categorize it as an echo, a ghost signal caused by atmospheric reflection. He knew such things happened, that they were usually dismissed within moments. But this signal did not fade. It pulsed with steady rhythm, moving in perfect synchronization with Air Force One. Marcus's pulse quickened. He glanced around the room. None of the senior controllers seemed concerned. They had seen this before, perhaps. Or perhaps they truly saw nothing unusual. He hesitated, torn between following their example and voicing the anomaly. The voice of discipline whispered that he should keep quiet, that drawing attention to himself would brand him as a nervous rookie. The voice of curiosity, the one his mother had nurtured, told him that something was wrong, that he must look closer. The decision pressed on him like weight. He looked back at the glowing screen, at the strange second dot trailing the president's plane like a phantom. For the first time that night, he felt the cold bite of dread in his stomach. Outside the tall windows of the tower, the night sky stretched endlessly, black and star-strewn. Somewhere in that sky, invisible to the human eye, the president's plane cut through the darkness. Marcus could not resist the urge any longer. He reached for the binoculars stored at the side of his console, raised them to his eyes, and turned them toward the heavens. And in that instant, the ordinary shift became something else entirely. Marcus held the binoculars so tightly that his knuckles whitened, pressing them against the contours of his face as though, by force alone, he could compel the night sky to reveal its secrets. The glass lenses trembled, not because of faulty equipment, but because of the tremor in his own hands. He steadied his breath, adjusted the focus, and sought the familiar brilliance of the presidential aircraft. There it was, unmistakable, the glowing streak of Air Force One gliding across the firmament like a luminous arrow. Its escort of fighter jets, sharp and predatory in their flight, maintained their disciplined formation, slicing through the darkness with flawless precision. For a moment, Marcus felt the awe he had expected to feel all night, the strange exhilaration of witnessing history from his post high in the tower. Then his eyes shifted a fraction higher and further back along the trajectory, and what he saw clamped his heart with cold fingers. A second shape hovered in the same corridor of sky, a form eerily similar to the presidential jet, yet blurred, indistinct, as though light itself resisted clinging to its surface. It was not a reflection, not a trick of the lens. It flew with intention, steady, unwavering, matching the path of Air Force One as though tethered to it by an invisible line. At times, the edges of its body seemed to ripple, as if the craft were half submerged in water, and then it sharpened again, too solid to be dismissed as illusion. Marcus lowered the binoculars, blinked hard, and looked again. The second aircraft remained. He tracked it, watched as it mirrored every subtle movement of the presidential plane. Whenever Air Force One adjusted altitude, the shadow plane did the same. Whenever the fighter escort banked slightly, it, too, maintained its position without falter. It was the ghost of a plane, a phantom that refused to vanish. A bead of sweat slipped down his temple. He lowered the binoculars completely, set them on the console, and turned back to his radar screen. The sweep of the electronic arm carved its circle across the display, painting the green-black surface with its luminous brush. There, pulsing steadily beside the presidential signature, was the echo. Not flickering, not erratic, but precise, strong, unyielding. It was a second point, and his console identified it as nothing more than noise, a glitch. The system dismissed it automatically, overlaying a small indicator that told him to ignore it. But Marcus could not ignore it, not after what his own eyes had just confirmed. He glanced sideways at the other controllers. They were calm, their faces composed, their eyes fixed on their own monitors. One older man rubbed his jaw idly as he noted coordinates into a log. A woman in a dark uniform sipped her coffee, her attention divided between two incoming civilian flights that needed spacing adjustments. None of them showed any sign that they saw what he did. For a brief moment, Marcus considered speaking up, but the voice of caution in his mind reminded him of the ridicule that might follow. Rookie paranoia, they would call it. The overactive imagination of a young man desperate to prove himself. Still, the second point blinked back at him, insistent, undeniable. He returned to the binoculars, his pulse pounding in his ears. Again, the twin aircraft appeared in the sky, a smear of reality half cloaked in distortion. His rational mind grasped for explanations. Perhaps it was an experimental escort, a new stealth plane flying in tandem with the presidential jet. Perhaps the light of the moon was playing tricks, though the moon was a thin crescent tonight and offered little illumination. Perhaps some new atmospheric phenomenon bent his vision. But none of these explanations matched the consistency of what he saw. As Air Force One advanced further across the sector, so too did the shadow follow. It kept its precise position, like the echo of a word spoken against a canyon wall, bound to the source but separate. Marcus felt the peculiar sensation of being watched himself, as though by seeing the phantom craft he had crossed a line he was never meant to cross, and now the sky regarded him with silent menace. Minutes dragged into an eternity. He fought the urge to call out, to ask the others if they saw it too. Once, he shifted slightly in his chair, letting his eyes wander toward his supervisor, but the man was busy with another feed, his expression unreadable in the glow of his screen. If Marcus mentioned it, what would happen? At best, a patronizing reassurance. At worst, suspicion. Controllers were not supposed to chase shadows. They were supposed to be precise, obedient, unflinching. But Marcus could not shake what he had seen. He turned back to the radar, determined to test the anomaly. He adjusted the filters, altered the range, toggled between frequency bands. The second point persisted. Sometimes its signal dimmed when he increased the filter strength, but it never vanished entirely. Always it hovered. Always it aligned perfectly with the president's plane. That level of persistence could not be coincidence. The fighters escorting Air Force One showed no reaction. If they knew of the twin, they gave no sign, maintaining their tight triangle formation around their charge. That, in itself, puzzled Marcus. If a second plane was trailing the president's aircraft at such a close distance, the escorts should have reacted with aggression, or at least reported it. The absence of response suggested only two possibilities. Either they were blind to it, or they were complicit. He returned to the binoculars once more. The night air shimmered around the shadow jet as though some invisible veil cloaked it. At times it seemed to swell, its outline clearer, then just as quickly it blurred again, a smear across the stars. He wondered whether it was even a normal aircraft at all. Could technology bend light this way, render something half seen, half unseen? He had read of experimental coatings, of stealth systems designed to scatter radar, but this was something beyond. This was as though the laws of perception themselves were being manipulated. His thoughts spiraled into darker places. What if this was no friendly shadow, but an enemy, a stalker in the night sky waiting for its moment to strike? Could it be possible that such a threat could tail the president without the entire military springing into action? Or was that precisely why no one reacted? Because the shadow did not represent an enemy at all, but a secret known only to a select few. The sweep of the radar marked the slow progression of Air Force One across Marcus's jurisdiction. Every pass reinforced the phantom signal. Every minute deepened his conviction. When the presidential plane neared the far edge of his screen, ready to pass into the next sector's care, the second point lingered with it, refusing to dissipate. Marcus leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass of the binoculars as he gave the sky one final, desperate inspection. The phantom jet was still there, clinging to its position as though it belonged to the president's shadow itself. When finally the call came to hand off the flight, Marcus complied, his voice steady, though his insides felt molten with confusion. The official record would show nothing unusual. Air Force One had passed through without incident, protected, flawless. Yet Marcus knew the truth was not so simple. His console continued to glow with the memory of the second point, and his eyes continued to burn with the imprint of that blurred companion in the heavens. He placed the binoculars carefully back on their stand, as though handling something fragile. His gaze lingered on the dark horizon beyond the tower's glass. He could not rid himself of the feeling that what he had seen was not meant to be seen at all. For the rest of the shift, every ordinary signal on his radar seemed somehow suspect. Every echo whispered of hidden realities. The night no longer felt quiet, but heavy, laden with secrets just out of reach. By the time his shift ended, Marcus was exhausted, not by the routine of his work, but by the weight of the discovery pressing against his thoughts. He walked out of the tower into the cool air before dawn, and for a moment he lifted his eyes skyward. The stars still shone, but to him they seemed changed, a backdrop against which invisible things might be moving, always unseen, always denied. He told himself it was best to forget, to file it away as an anomaly. Yet, even as he whispered the reassurance, he knew he would not forget. He could not. As he drove home through the sleeping city, the image returned again and again, the bright certainty of Air Force One and its escorts, and behind them the flickering blur, a twin that existed both within reality and outside it. The second point, the ghost plane. He clenched the steering wheel tighter. Somewhere above, perhaps at that very moment, it was still following, still trailing in silence, a secret that mocked the very systems meant to reveal truth. And Marcus, young and untested, had been the one to glimpse it. The city was still wrapped in the blue silence of dawn when Marcus pulled his car into the small driveway of his apartment building. He turned off the engine and sat motionless, the faint hum of cooling metal beneath the hood filling the air. He should have felt relief, the natural easing that came after a long shift, yet all he felt was a gnawing unease that seemed to burrow deeper into his mind with every passing minute. The image of the blurred aircraft would not leave him. No matter how many times he told himself it had been a trick of the radar, an echo, or some atmospheric anomaly, he saw again and again the steady form moving behind Air Force One, clinging to it like a shadow. He dragged himself upstairs and into his apartment, dropping his keys on the small table by the door. The blinds were still drawn, and the rooms carried the stale scent of yesterday's coffee. He collapsed onto his couch and pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes, but the phantom craft remained in the darkness behind his eyelids. He wondered if perhaps he had imagined it all, a kind of waking dream born of the pressure of responsibility. He thought of his father's words, the lectures on discipline and duty, on the dangers of letting imagination cloud perception. Was this what had happened to him? Had he allowed his excitement over Air Force One to conjure an illusion that wasn't there? The rational explanation was tempting, But when he opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling, the memory of the binoculars returned with vivid clarity. He had seen it. He had watched its edges shimmer, watched it shift and hold its place. Radar echoes flickered and died. Illusions vanished when stared at too long. This had endured. That endurance was the part he could not ignore. He rose, unable to sit still, and moved to the small desk in his living room where his personal computer sat waiting. From the pocket of his jacket, he drew out the small flash drive he had carried out of the tower, the one on which he had quietly saved the raw radar data. It was against regulations to copy flight logs without authorization, but he had told himself at the time that he was only preserving evidence of his diligence, a record of his first shift with Air Force One. Now, he knew he had kept it for another reason, one he hadn't admitted even to himself. He needed proof. He inserted the drive and opened the files. Lines of numbers and codes spilled across the screen, the language of machines translating the movements of the sky into comprehensible order. Marcus navigated to the precise window of time when Air Force One had passed through his sector, his heart quickening as he scrolled. There it was, the unmistakable signature of the presidential aircraft accompanied by the marks of its fighter escorts. And there, beside it, not flagged by the system but present in the raw feed, was the second trace. Weak at first, but steady, moving in exact synchrony. His throat tightened. It was not his imagination. It had been real enough to be recorded. For a long time he stared at the data, the glowing characters painting his face in cold light. He thought about taking a screenshot, saving a duplicate in case the file was ever altered. But he hesitated. A part of him feared even preserving it. Knowledge was weight, and this knowledge felt dangerous. He shut the file and leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under him. The unease grew through the morning. He tried to sleep, but every time his eyes closed he saw the flickering twin pacing Air Force One like some spectral guardian. He remembered the casual dismissal of his colleagues, the way none of them had seemed alarmed, and wondered if they had truly not seen it, or if they had chosen silence out of habit. In the world of controllers, silence was sometimes safer than speculation. He recalled the sharp glance from his supervisor when he had lingered too long on the radar, the unspoken message not to ask questions that had no acceptable answers. When afternoon light finally seeped into his apartment, Marcus rose again, restless, and paced the narrow rooms. Doubt warred with conviction inside him. He was young, inexperienced. It would be so easy to conclude that he had misunderstood, that the data was flawed, that he had let his imagination run wild. But the conviction whispered louder. The data had been there. The image had been there. The binoculars had shown him what his console tried to hide. As the day dragged on, Marcus found himself rehearsing conversations in his head. He imagined bringing it up casually to one of the veterans, asking whether they had ever seen such a thing. But each imagined response ended the same way, with a dismissive laugh or worse, with suspicion and a warning to keep his focus on the work that mattered. He knew enough about the culture of the tower to understand that a rookie raising alarms about shadows would not earn respect. He would earn a reputation he might never shake. By the time the sky outside darkened again, Marcus felt as though he were carrying a secret too large for him. He prepared for his next shift with mechanical precision, dressing, gathering his gear, checking his credentials. As he drove toward the airport, the roads glowing under street lamps, he wondered whether he would see the phantom again. Part of him dreaded it. Another part longed for confirmation. The tower greeted him with its familiar hum of machinery, the bright glow of screens casting the controllers in shades of green and blue. He took his seat, greeted with nods that carried no warmth or suspicion, simply routine. He scanned his sector, noting the commercial flights moving like beads of light across the screen. His hands moved automatically, but his mind was elsewhere, tuned to the possibility that at any moment another impossible shape might emerge. The hours passed quietly. He checked frequencies, logged trajectories, responded to queries. No anomalies appeared. Yet the memory of the night before colored everything. Every flicker on his screen, every faint signal made his chest tighten until it resolved into harmless traffic. By midnight he was exhausted again, not from work but from vigilance, from the constant bracing for something only he seemed to know was possible. As dawn approached for the second time, Marcus leaned back and stared through the glass walls of the tower. The horizon blushed faintly with coming light, and in that light he thought he saw movement far above. Too faint to mark, too distant to be real. He shook his head and rubbed his eyes. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was only the afterimage of obsession. But deep inside he knew he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just a controller watching flights pass across a map. He was a witness to something hidden, something that should not have been revealed. And once witnessed, it could not be forgotten. By the end of his second shift, Marcus understood that he was caught between two truths, the official truth of silence and the private truth of what he had seen. The conflict tore at him, left him unsure of his own judgment. Yet, in the quietest moments, when doubt retreated, conviction returned with frightening clarity. There had been another plane. It had flown behind Air Force One, and it was not supposed to exist. The third morning, without sleep, left Marcus hollow-eyed and unsteady, though the exhaustion that tugged at his limbs was less from the night shifts than from the relentless churning of his mind. The vision of the second aircraft had not faded with time, as illusions often did, but sharpened, taking on the quality of a recurring dream that lingers even in waking hours. He could not eat without imagining the shimmer of metal half hidden in distortion. He could not cross a room without picturing the radar screen with its twin points pulsing in stubborn defiance of explanation. His apartment had become a cage where the silence pressed in on him, forcing him to turn over the memory again and again until it grew unbearable. On that morning, he made a decision. If no one else would acknowledge what he had seen, he would search for evidence on his own. He needed something tangible, something that would prove to him that he was not unraveling beneath the strain of his new position. His access at the tower was limited, but every controller had clearance to consult past records when necessary for training or analysis. It was a matter of routine, to review logs from prior years to study unusual traffic patterns or anomalies. All he had to do was request the data under the guise of diligence, and no one would suspect the true reason. He arrived at the tower earlier than scheduled, his badge granting him entry into the chilled corridors before the bulk of the night crew had even departed. The building was quieter at that hour, humming only with the endless servers that stored the memories of the skies. Rows of terminals stretched into the gloom of the archival room, their monitors glowing faintly like eyes half shut. He settled at one of them, his heart already hammering, and entered the credentials that gave him access. The interface was sterile, nothing but dates and designations, yet behind those strings of numbers lived the record of everything that had crossed the heavens above his country for decades. Marcus scrolled with purpose, seeking not random nights, but the dates when Air Force One had passed through their sector. There were fewer of them than he expected. The president did not travel by air as frequently as the news made it seem. Still, there were enough to examine. The first file opened with ordinary clarity. The radar sweeps painted their endless circles across the screen, resurrecting the movement of aircraft from months ago as though the past were happening again. He found the mark of Air Force One easily enough, bright and confident, accompanied by the predictable escorts. He felt a thrill of familiarity, as though greeting an old acquaintance. But then, after adjusting the filters and peering into the raw data, he saw it. Faint, nearly imperceptible, but there nonetheless, a second trace moving just behind the president's plane, mirroring its every step. He sat back, breath caught in his throat. The memory of his own experience had not betrayed him. The anomaly had appeared before. He leaned forward again, opening the next file and next. Each time, the pattern repeated. The official overlay filtered the signal into nothingness, marking it as background noise, but the raw data stubbornly preserved it. Not strong, never strong, but steady, persistent, undeniable. Marcus's pulse quickened as he copied down timestamps and coordinates into a small notebook he had carried from home. The pattern began to emerge with startling clarity. Not every presidential flight bore the twin, but those that did always shared the same characteristics: long-distance travel, often over the ocean, sometimes into regions of heightened security concern. Whenever the president ventured into areas where risk was greatest, the second signal was there, shadowing faithfully. He could not stop himself from whispering under his breath, as though naming it gave it form. You were always there. The hours slipped past unnoticed as he combed through the archives. He lost track of how many nights he revisited, how many blips he studied until his eyes blurred from strain. With each confirmation, the knot of fear and exhilaration inside him grew tighter. What he had witnessed was not a freak occurrence. It was part of a system, a hidden rhythm beneath the official order of the skies. He thought back to the men and women who had worked beside him in the tower, their calm faces, their refusal to acknowledge anything unusual. Had they known? Had they looked away by design, instructed never to comment on the second mark? Or had they been trained to believe the official filter, to accept the data as it appeared on the surface and never question what lay beneath? The possibility that they had all silently colluded in the same denial unsettled him more than outright deception. At one point, as he leaned back to rub the tension from his neck, he caught sight of the supervisor walking past the doorway of the archival room. The man did not stop, did not glance inside, but Marcus felt a chill ripple down his spine nonetheless. If anyone noticed how many presidential files he was reviewing, questions might arise. He closed the current file quickly and opened a more routine log, masking his intent. When the supervisor's footsteps faded, he returned to his task, his urgency heightened by the awareness that he was trespassing into truths no one wanted unearthed. By the time his shift officially began that night, Marcus felt the weight of discovery pressing on him like a stone. He performed his duties as required, his hands moving with precision across the console, his voice steady in his transmissions, but beneath the surface, his mind churned with the knowledge he had unearthed. The second aircraft was not a one-time apparition. It was a recurring presence, a ghost built into the architecture of the president's journeys. When dawn crept over the horizon once again, painting the glass walls of the tower with pale light, Marcus lingered at his station even after his relief had arrived. He stared at the empty screen, now cleared of the night's activity, and thought of the files locked within the servers below. They were like fossils buried in stone, evidence of creatures that the official record insisted had never walked the earth. But he had touched them, traced their shapes with his own eyes, and the knowledge bound him now. Driving home, he tried to convince himself that he had done enough, that curiosity had been satisfied. But the moment he entered his apartment and set down his things, he felt the hunger for more return, with even greater force. The fragments he had found were pieces of a puzzle, but the whole picture remained hidden. And Marcus, for all his doubts, was no longer capable of turning away. The next night, he returned again to the archives, this time more cautious, waiting until the room was empty before slipping into the seat at the terminal. He wore his headset, pretending to monitor external frequencies, so that if anyone entered, he could claim he was simply double-checking an old log for a training review. But no one came. Alone in the hum of servers, he dove deeper into the past. Patterns grew sharper with each discovery. He noted how the twin signal often vanished entirely when Air Force One was within national airspace, only to reappear as soon as the plane crossed into international skies. He noted how on nights of heightened military tension, the twin was sometimes stronger, almost brazen in its steadiness, as if no effort was being made to conceal it from those who knew where to look. And he noted the careful erasure in the official reports, the way every trace of it was smoothed away until nothing remained but the clean illusion of a solitary aircraft. By the end of that second night in the archives, Marcus's notebook was filled with times and coordinates, his handwriting slanting with haste. He stared at the pages, the columns of evidence, and knew without question that he was standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous. His hands trembled as he closed the book and slipped it into his bag. When he left the tower, the sun was already high and the streets bustled with the ordinariness of daily life. Commuters walked with coffees, buses hissed at stops, children laughed on their way to school. The world seemed oblivious, safe, and ordinary. Yet Marcus carried in his bag the proof that above this world, hidden in plain sight, another truth glided on silent wings. And for the first time he realized that he was no longer an observer of the skies. He had become an intruder into a secret carefully guarded, and there could be consequences for knowing too much. Marcus had not realized how thinly stretched he had become until the third night he sat at his console and found his concentration fraying at the edges of routine. Every movement of his hands, every report he delivered, every confirmation he gave into the headset was automatic, executed with a mechanical precision that concealed the storm within. To his colleagues, he appeared steady, another young controller settling into the rhythm of the work. But inside he was consumed by what he had uncovered. The traces in the archives had not satisfied his need for explanation. They had only deepened the mystery, carved into him the conviction that he had stepped onto a path from which there was no return. When he returned home after another endless dawn, his body exhausted but his mind alight, he placed his notebook on the desk and opened his laptop. The official channels had given him confirmation of the anomaly, but not its meaning. If such a presence existed, if another craft truly shadowed Air Force One, then surely someone else must have noticed. He could not be alone in this. He needed to know whether other eyes had glimpsed the same strange twin in the skies. He began his search carefully, aware of the risks. The internet was a labyrinth of noise, but among the noise were communities of specialists, places where controllers and aviation enthusiasts gathered under the cloak of anonymity. He typed queries with deliberate caution, phrasing them obliquely at first, questions about radar echoes, about unusual patterns in presidential flights, about the limits of atmospheric reflection. For hours, the results yielded nothing but speculation from amateurs, wild theories about secret weapons and invisible aircraft that he dismissed as fantasy. He had seen something real, something that lived not in imagination but in the cold certainty of raw data. Still, as the night bled into morning, he found himself deeper in obscure forums, tucked into corners of the digital world where discussions were guarded and technical. Some threads were little more than collections of pilots, trading stories of anomalies that could be explained by weather or equipment. Others were filled with conspiracy theorists weaving elaborate tales of invisible fleets circling the globe. He almost closed his laptop in disgust until one phrase caught his eye: the second tale. The thread was old, years old, its most recent post buried beneath layers of time. But as Marcus scrolled, his pulse quickened. The user who had written it claimed to be a controller stationed far from Marcus's own tower, yet the description was eerily familiar. The poster spoke of monitoring Air Force One years ago and seeing on the raw radar feed a shadow trace, one that moved with such perfect mimicry that it could not be dismissed as mere error. Others in the thread had mocked the claim, calling it paranoia, but a few had responded with cryptic agreement. One wrote that they, too, had seen the second point, but had been told by supervisors never to record it in their notes. Another hinted that the phenomenon was part of the design, and that to ask too many questions about it was to risk one's career. Marcus leaned forward, heart hammering. His hands moved quickly across the keys as he traced the posting history of these users, but one by one the accounts led to dead ends. Profiles had been deleted, threads erased, posts scrubbed from the archives as though someone had come through with a fine comb, leaving only fragments behind. The more he looked, the clearer it became that traces of conversation had been deliberately removed. What remained were tantalizing hints, ghosts of testimonies that had once existed but were no longer permitted to survive. He sat back in his chair, staring at the pale light of the monitor. The sensation that had first come to him in the tower returned now with doubled force. The feeling of trespass, of venturing into places that were not meant for him. It was not only the phantom plane that was hidden, but also the knowledge of it. Those who had spoken were gone, their words erased, their voices silenced. The apartment was still, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Marcus felt as though the silence itself were watching him, pressing against him with invisible weight. He thought again of his father, the stern man who had taught him that some truths must remain unspoken for the sake of duty. He wondered what his father would say now, whether he would call him a fool for chasing ghosts when his job demanded precision and loyalty. But Marcus could not turn back. The puzzle gripped him too fiercely, the need to understand burning stronger than the fear of consequence. He returned to the forums again, this time searching deeper, following links hidden in obscure posts, strings of numbers that opened back doors into older archives. Hours passed as he scrolled through endless discussions until he found another fragment that chilled him. A user had written, "We see what we shouldn't. They tell us it's noise. It isn't. Watch long enough and you'll see the blur beside the eagle." The post was signed only with a string of digits, the account long since deleted. Marcus copied the words into his notebook, staring at them until they blurred. The blur beside the eagle. It was exactly what he had seen, the ghostly shimmer trailing the proud certainty of Air Force One. Others had witnessed it. Others had tried to name it. And others, it seemed, had been silenced for doing so. He closed the laptop suddenly, his breath unsteady. His apartment felt smaller than ever, the shadows in the corners too deep, the stillness too heavy. He rose and paced the floor, his mind racing. There was comfort in knowing he was not alone, but that comfort was poisoned by the knowledge that those who had come before him had been erased. He was not the first to step onto this path, but he might be the last if he was not careful. When he returned to work the following night, he carried the weight of this discovery like a second skin. He sat at his console, the glow of the monitors painting his face in green light, and listened to the voices on the radio with renewed suspicion. Every glance from his supervisor seemed sharper, every silence more deliberate. He imagined that they knew what he had been searching, that his nights at home had already been traced, his questions noted. Paranoia whispered at him, but alongside it came certainty. He was close to something hidden, and the closer he came, the more the walls seemed to close in. Still, he could not stop. Each shift became a torment of restraint as he fought the urge to lean over to a colleague and ask, "Did you see it too? Do you know about the second plane?" The words clung to his tongue but never escaped, trapped by the fear of what their answers might bring. So he returned again and again to his private notebook, filling its pages with fragments from forums, times, and dates from archives, whispers of the blur that followed the eagle through the night sky. By the end of that week, Marcus understood that he was no longer searching for proof. He already had proof. What he searched for now was meaning. Why did the twin exist? What purpose did it serve? And why was the truth of it guarded with such ruthless silence? The questions circled him like vultures as he left the tower at dawn, the city stirring awake beneath the pale wash of light. He walked the streets with his shoulders tight, his eyes scanning the sky. Somewhere above, he knew, the eagle still flew, and beside it, unseen by the world, its blur kept pace. He had read enough, seen enough to know he was not imagining. But he had also learned enough to realize that by seeking answers he was trespassing into a secret that consumed those who looked too long. And so still, despite the fear, he knew he would keep looking. The silence of the tower had become unbearable. For Marcus, every shift now carried the weight of suspicion. Every hour passed beneath the gaze of a truth that pressed itself against him, though no one spoke of it. He had filled his notebook with times and dates, copied phrases from strangers who had whispered the same forbidden observations he had made, and yet none of it answered the question that burned at the core of him. He knew the twin existed. He had confirmed its presence in the archives, had seen it with his own eyes. But he did not know why. What was its purpose? Why did it move with such careful precision, hiding in the blurred edge of perception, always tethered to the president's plane? The days became a blur of ritual. He returned home from each night shift with the rising sun on his back, his body heavy with exhaustion and his mind feverishly awake. He would brew coffee he rarely drank, sit before his computer and search for scraps of information that might reveal more. The official world of aviation spoke of Air Force One as though it were simply a symbol, a vessel of power, a flying command center. None of those polished descriptions contained even a hint of the shadow craft. But, buried in technical journals, in whispered accounts from former pilots, in redacted reports, Marcus began to find threads. It was not easy. Every trail seemed to lead into silence. Some documents were scrubbed, lines blacked out into meaninglessness. Others contained only ambiguous references, phrases like secondary formation integrity or redundant escort protocol that could be dismissed as routine, but in context felt heavier. Yet, as he pieced the fragments together, A shape began to emerge in his mind. The double was not an accident. It was not a hallucination, nor an unexplained fluke of atmosphere. It was deliberate. A program existed, hidden beneath layers of classification to ensure that the President of the United States was never truly where the world thought he was. Marcus remembered one phrase he had read on a forgotten forum, scribbled in his notebook, the blur beside the eagle. It echoed now with grim clarity. Air Force One, proud and obvious, was the eagle. The blur was its decoy, its mirror, its shadow. When the president traveled into the most dangerous skies, the double went with him, designed to confuse, to mislead, to take the blow that might otherwise fall on the real aircraft. The realization came not in a sudden burst, but in slow waves, each one eroding the cliff of doubt inside him until at last he stood staring at the truth bare and undeniable. The twin was a defense, the most secretive form of protection. A vessel disguised, cloaked, and hidden, moving always with the president's plane, but never meant to be acknowledged. It was the ghost of Air Force One, and its purpose was survival. Yet the truth did not soothe him. It frightened him. Because to accept that the double existed was to accept also that the world was more dangerous than he had ever been told. If such a measure was necessary, then the threats surrounding the president were far greater, far more imminent than ordinary citizens were allowed to believe. To hide such a machine from public knowledge meant that its very existence was too volatile, too destabilizing to reveal. And Marcus, who had stumbled across it by accident, now carried that knowledge like a weight pressing into his bones. One night, after his shift, he lingered again in the archives. He told himself it was to confirm what he already knew, but in truth it was compulsion. He searched not just for the presence of the twin, but for patterns in its behavior. He noticed how it sometimes appeared closer, sometimes further back, as if adjusting depending on conditions. He noticed how it was absent in domestic flights, but always present when the plane crossed international boundaries. He noticed, too, how its signal was always weaker, as though deliberately masked, engineered to blend with noise so that only those who knew to look for it would find it. The technology baffled him. How could an aircraft shimmer that way, as if wrapped in a cloak of distortion? How could it avoid detection by all but the rawest data? He read of experimental coatings, of adaptive camouflage that bent radar and scattered light, but the descriptions seemed like science fiction brought to life. Perhaps, he thought, that was exactly what it was meant to be. Technology decades ahead of what the world was allowed to know, reserved only for the protection of the most guarded life on Earth. Sitting in the dim glow of the terminal, Marcus felt the magnitude of the secret pressing in on him. He was not supposed to know this. No controller was supposed to dwell on raw anomalies. The filters existed to enforce blindness, to ensure that what he had uncovered remained hidden. His colleagues had learned long ago to ignore the blur, to accept the silence handed down by their superiors. And now he understood why. To know was to bear a burden too great, too dangerous. He thought of those who had posted online, their accounts erased, their words vanished. Had they known too much, spoken too freely, and been silenced for it? The idea chilled him. He imagined faceless figures monitoring the forums, scrubbing away evidence, ensuring that no hint of the double escaped into the wild. He imagined those same figures watching him now, tracking his searches, noting his late-night inquiries. For the first time since this began, the fear grew sharper than curiosity. Yet, even in fear, he could not let go. The truth had taken root inside him, and to deny it now would be to live a lie every time he sat before the radar. He would see the official record of Air Force One and know it was incomplete, a half-truth hiding a greater machine. He would hear the voices of his supervisors and know they concealed more than they revealed. He would look at the sky and imagine not one aircraft but two, one acknowledged and one erased, flying together above a world that had no idea. Driving home that morning, the streets empty in the weak light, Marcus felt a hollowness in his chest. The city went about its routine, blind to the truth that haunted him. To everyone else, the president's plane was a symbol of security, of power, of stability. To Marcus, it had become a reminder of secrecy, of shadows. The double had changed the way he saw everything. He looked at the horizon and thought of veils, of masks, of truths hidden just out of sight. That night, alone in his apartment, he opened his notebook again. He stared at the pages filled with times, dates, coordinates, phrases scrawled from strangers. He added a single line at the bottom of the page. The twin is real. Its purpose is to protect. But who protects us from the truth? The words stared back at him in the dim light of his lamp. He felt the chill of them, the recognition that he had gone too far to ever turn back. He had pulled the veil aside and seen what lay beneath, and now he could never unsee it. The double was real, and knowing that was both revelation and curse. Marcus closed the notebook with trembling hands. He sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the city outside his window, and wondered how long it would be before his curiosity drew him further, before he made a mistake that could not be erased. For now he had the truth, but the truth was not a gift. It was a shadow that clung to him, as inseparable as the blur that followed the eagle across the sky. Marcus woke with the same heaviness that had haunted him for weeks, a weight in his chest that no amount of sleep could ease. Even when his eyes were closed, the image of the blurred aircraft pursued him, shimmering in the darkness like a phantom that would never release its hold. He had tried to fight it, tried to set aside his notebook and close his computer to live as though his life had not been changed by what he had seen. But the knowledge would not fade. It had grown roots inside him, anchoring itself deeper with each shift, with each quiet dawn walk from the tower, until it became impossible to imagine his work without the shadow of the double looming at the edges of every radar sweep. When he returned to the tower now, the routine of the job felt transformed. Where once he had seen only order and control, he now saw layers of secrecy stitched carefully into the fabric of duty. Each voice on the radio was another thread in the pattern of silence. Each green dot on his screen was a reminder that what appeared on the surface was only part of the story. He watched the faces of his colleagues with suspicion, wondering how many of them knew. How many had trained their eyes to glide past the anomalies? How many had chosen to keep the secret buried for their own survival? They were all so calm, so practiced, and their composure struck him now not as professionalism, but as complicity. He found himself staring too long at his supervisor, searching for signs of recognition in the man's expressionless face. Sometimes he thought he saw it. The faint tightening of a jaw, the flicker of an eye that lingered too long on his screen. Other times he wondered if his imagination had been sharpened by paranoia. He had entered a world where doubt was his constant companion, and he no longer trusted even his own instincts fully. The nights at the radar had become a torment. Every sweep of the electronic arm across the screen threatened to reveal the phantom once again, and though he told himself he dreaded it, he knew that he longed for it too. He wanted confirmation. wanted the undeniable presence of the double to rise again from the noise so that he would know he had not dreamt it all. Yet, at the same time, each confirmation would be another nail in the coffin of his peace of mind. To see it again would mean that he was still trapped in this cage of knowledge, unable to escape, condemned to carry the secret like a burden across the rest of his life. When Air Force One crossed their skies once more, he was almost feverish with anticipation. His eyes fixed on the sweep, his breath caught with each pulse of the green light. And there it was. The Eagle, unmistakable, surrounded by its fighters, moving with serene confidence. And there, just behind, the blur. His pulse quickened. His fingers dug into the edge of the console. It was weaker this time, almost hesitant, but it was there. The twin still followed, still clung to the president's path as though chained by fate. He forced his face into stillness, aware of the eyes around him, but inside he burned with a strange mixture of triumph and dread. He was not mad. The phantom was real. The notebook filled with times and dates, the erased forum posts, the whispers and archives, none of it had been the invention of an exhausted mind. The twin existed, and it flew again, a silent companion that only he seemed willing to acknowledge. When the shift ended and dawn returned, Marcus walked through the city in a daze. The streets bustled with the ordinariness of daily life. Cars honking, children dragging backpacks, vendors opening shutters to prepare for the day. No one around him had any idea that far above their heads, hidden behind the veil of secrecy, two planes had crossed the skies instead of one. To them, the president's journey was just another news story, a symbol of order and power. To Marcus, it had become a symbol of shadows and lies, a reminder that the truth was never what it seemed. At home, he opened his notebook again, though he no longer needed to. The pages were crammed with evidence, lines of data, phrases that to anyone else would mean nothing but to him told a story of deception so vast it seemed impossible. He read them over and over, trying to find in them some sense of meaning, some justification that would let him rest. But the only answer that emerged was silence, the silence of a secret so tightly kept that it destroyed anyone who spoke of it. He thought of the anonymous voices online, the ones who had whispered of the blur beside the Eagle, and of how quickly they had been erased. He imagined them as men and women like himself, controllers, pilots, technicians, each one catching a glimpse of the forbidden and daring to speak it aloud. He imagined how they must have felt, how the knowledge must have consumed them too, until someone in the shadows decided they had spoken too much. Were they silenced gently, with warnings and dismissals, or harshly, with careers destroyed, with lives broken? He could not know, but the possibility haunted him. Marcus began to notice things that unsettled him further. A man watching him too closely at the coffee shop he always visited after his shifts. A car that seemed to follow him across 2 consecutive mornings before vanishing into traffic. An email in his inbox with no subject line and no content, blank but undeniable. He told himself it was coincidence, the paranoia of a mind stretched too far. But deep down, he wondered if the secret had already reached back toward him, if the blur that haunted the skies had cast its shadow onto his life as well. And yet, even with the fear growing sharper, he could not let go. He had become addicted to the mystery, enslaved to the need to know more. His life had narrowed until it revolved entirely around the secret. He no longer saw himself as merely a controller. He was a witness, chosen or cursed, marked by the truth he had stumbled upon. Every glance at the sky reminded him that he carried something the rest of the world did not, something it was not meant to hold. That night, lying awake in the darkness of his apartment, Marcus accepted what he had become. He would never be free of the blur. It would follow him as faithfully as it followed Air Force One, a shadow tethered to his thoughts, a ghost welded to his memory. He imagined the planes above him even now, the eagle gleaming in the night and the double trailing just behind, unseen, unacknowledged, and he felt a shiver of kinship. He too had become a shadow, moving through a world that did not know him, burdened by a truth that could not be spoken. The price of discovery was not a single moment of revelation, nor even the fear of reprisal. The true price was the permanence of it, the way knowledge once gained could never be unlearned. Marcus had stepped across a threshold, and the door had shut behind him. He would carry the blur for the rest of his life, silent, invisible, inevitable. And so, when the next dawn came and he lifted his eyes to the sky, he no longer searched only for the familiar certainty of Air Force One. He searched for the shimmer just behind, the phantom that the world refused to acknowledge. For him, it was no longer just a secret or a mystery. It was a part of him, as inseparable as his own shadow. And in that realization he felt both terror and strange, bitter pride. He had seen what should not be seen, and he would never be the same. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden truth, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next shocking story. Check out our other videos right now for even more secrets the world was never meant to see. And don't keep this mystery to yourself. Share this video with your friends and